the crux of the problem to begin with was around how the EU was going to fund this loan for Ukraine, was around essentially where the money came from, because the original plan had been to try and push through an agreement to use frozen Russian assets that currently sat in Europe to essentially use as collateral against a loan for Ukraine directly. Brussels, which is where who are holding most of these funds, essentially said no thanks, because they were scared that, as is coming to be the case, Russia is trying to sue Belgium to get hold of these assets. So instead, what seems to have happened is that Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which are sort of three nationalist governments within the EU that sort of probably, I think it's fair to call them the most Russia-friendly governments in the EU at the moment, essentially said, we will allow the EU to use its own budget, its own funds to give this loan to Ukraine, as long as we don't have to pay in any money or kind of essentially provide any reassurances that we will back up the EU budget if things go wrong or if Moscow tries to sue.
Yeah, so they want it both ways, I suppose, don't they, those particular countries who want to be in the EU but not paying for this particular loan. It falls short, doesn't it, of the estimated 135 billion that Ukraine needs to stay afloat?
Yes, exactly, it does. And the trouble is that essentially without any of this money, Ukraine would have been in real significant difficulties sort of in the coming months. Some experts have talked about the fact that really sort of by the middle of the year, Ukraine would have to start thinking about what sort of civil service salaries to cut, that sort of thing. So any money at all will help Ukraine. But yeah, you're right. This really falls short of what they need to continue funding defence, weaponry, armed forces for the coming year or two. So it's going to be interesting to see how Ukraine finds the money for that.
And Britain is still, very publicly behind Ukraine, obviously making its own arrangements as to how it supports Ukraine. But that whole question of unfreezing assets, Russian assets, it's been hovering over this whole question for some time, hasn't it? Not just in the EU, but for the UK as well.
Yeah, that's right. It's something that has been, as you so aptly put it, hovering over sort of the discussion around the conflict basically since it started. Whether or not it's used to continue funding Ukraine's sort of ongoing fight against Russia, or whether it's used as essentially in the form of a sort of a reparations loan to help Ukraine rebuild after the war. Not least, of course, because there are questions around really how easy it might be to force Moscow to pay their own reparations to Ukraine once any kind of peace deal is agreed or any kind of ceasefire comes into play.
And I see as well that the president of Russia, President Putin, has been speaking to journalists saying that, amongst other things, the West is, quotes, making Russia the enemy, and that Kyiv is delaying the end of this war.
Yes, this is a line that Putin has repeated several times, particularly since Trump has come back into the White House and really kind of trying to galvanise efforts to bring about a peace deal. And essentially, it's a lot of, I think, what's going on is that Putin is wanting to not publicly really give away any kind of sense that he is the blocker on ending this war, which of course he is. It is, after all, he that started the war. He has the capability of finishing the war just by sending orders to his troops to stop. But for the purposes of essentially stringing along Trump's administration, who are really trying to put the pressure on to get an end to the war, he's not. This is why he's wanting to essentially deflect the blame onto Ukraine, onto Europe, and say, really, this has got nothing to do with me. Essentially, as long as they agree to what I'm asking to, I'll stop any time.
And it's interesting to read the quotes from a vox pop that was carried out on the streets of Ukraine, that is. And there's a mixture of gratitude for the loan. There's a bit of sort of pessimism about the degree to which it will be free from the corruption inside Ukraine, something that the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, has said he is tackling. He sacked at least one of his inner circle, didn't he, recently, over corruption allegations. But there's, it's easy, isn't it, for us here in the UK to think there is a total block of agreed opinion about the war in Ukraine. And it's simply not the case, is it? Or indeed about the government.
No, completely. And I think it's very easy for us here, where this war is about to enter its fifth year, and Ukrainians have been under constant bombardments. There are blackouts, and of course, not to mention kind of the sacrifices, the losses that people, civilians and troops, have experienced in that time. So in that context, there is a portion of Ukrainian population who were thinking, okay, well, maybe there is a way to kind of, bring this fighting to a close. But at the same time, when there's been so much sacrifice, it's perfectly understandable that for a lot of Ukrainians, they are then also asking, well, what was it all for? If we are going to be sold out by a deal that does not have Ukraine's best interests at heart, really, what was all of this for? What has our country been fighting for? So that is the responsibility that the leaders who are trying to, at the moment, bring some kind of peace deal into existence should also bear in mind as they do so.